Welcome back, friends, fellow philosophers, to this Wild Isle podcast. I have with me the legendary man who I've been trying to get on this podcast for more than a year, Adam Mick. How are you doing, Adam?
I'm doing great. It's been not something that I was necessarily putting off on purpose, but I am glad to meet with you. Legendary is a little bit of an overkill or overstatement, but excited to talk with you today.
Yeah, I disagree. I don't think it's an overstatement, making Adam spit up his coffee. So, Adam, for our listeners, just can you let them know just a tiny bit about yourself, what you do, and yeah, that'd be sufficient.
Sure. Yeah, I my profession is I'm a pastor of a local church, a non-denominational church called Christ Community Church. It's a non-denominational Christian church. Been here in Wheeling for about 12 years, and before that, I had been in banking for 7 years, and had been a pastor of a little bit more of a fundamental Baptist church in Arizona. Prior to that, many negative experiences that at the time seemed negative, but um, turned into positive, as most things that are negative do in our lives. And I'm sure we can talk about that a little bit later. I've been married for 19 years. Same thing, lots of ups and lots of downs, but much better these last 12 or 13 years than the first seven or so. And I have two wonderful kids, 16 and 13. And so life is an adventure, and life looks much different now than it did even just 4 or 5 years ago, as is the case for just about everybody with these crazy last few years that we've gone through.
Yeah, so you can see why I called Adam there a legend. Oh, my listeners. No, really. So you have a rather interesting background that it will come up. You mentioned, let's say, all the things that seem to be at the time negative being positive. I think that's going to end up, whether we like it or not, being a theme of the conversation. But before we begin and get into it, I'm going to shill a few things. Firstly, if you would like to be part of this podcast, or have a topic that you'd like to recommend, that's totally possible. You can contact me at my website, wildilelit.com/contact. Go there, check it out, fill out the form, send in a topic. If you happen to know me or know of me or some way I could vet who you are out there on the wide world of the internet, do so. And I'd love to have you on. We can record online and it would be an excellent time. While you're there at wildilelit.com, you could check out my book, Wand Smoke Broken. It is a weird fantasy fiction novel, reads kind of like a cross between a Western or a literary novel. If you're into that kind of thing, check that out there. And while you're there, if you happen to be an author, you can hire me. I am an editor and I run the Wild Isle Style Guide. So if you want to expand the style of your writing, break out of the kind of, the generic that you see on the shelf of every bookstore and gigantic waves, shelf after shelf, give me a message. Use that same form, wildilelit.com/contact, and we can work together. You can write stylistically. I can embed theme into your work. And other than that, I think we can begin for today. Now, Adam, here's a weird question. You might have, if you, I think you've listened to me talk
I
to
have,
Josh Broverman, right?
yeah, both interviews.
Yeah. So something that I always thought was funny with my conversations with Josh. Josh, this applies a little bit less so, but not too much less so. Is that we are both rather secular people, but we always ended up coming back to rather spiritual or religious topics, which is it's funny, right? But it seems to be something that is rather particular to our day. I have another friend who is often on the podcast, named Nathan, and the same thing ends up happening in our conversations in a different way. Um, but the question that I want to springboard from that is, do you see that? I mean, this is your profession, so you're in it amongst religious folk, but just in general in life. Um, are you seeing that amongst people, like a kind of return to spirituality away from the particular secular materialism of the past generation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's some sort of longing that we all have for more, and I think that there's a mystery out there, and we can grasp for knowledge, and we can try to find satisfaction and joy in all kinds of different things. And accomplishments and achievements, but I think it always leaves us longing for a little bit more. And so, especially with how much has been out of our control these last several years, with just kind of the chaos of the world, with politics and yeah, I mean, just about everything, just the craziness of the world. I think that there is a longing for something deeper and something more that's increasing. At the same time, there's kind of we're sick of religious establishments that have all the answers and are trying to force their way down our throat. And so it's kind of a weird, we're done with religion, but we're longing for spirituality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, those are the usual terms when it comes to like the institution. So you might say the human side of the actually you could think of it as an inhuman side. I'll explain that in a second. But for the sake of ease of conversation, so you have the let's say spiritual versus human, or the spiritual versus material. The institution being a a construct around which people can gather and then experience the spiritual. That's the idea.
Sure.
Why then? I ask myself questions often. Adam, I don't know if you ever heard me do this.
I have.
Well,
It's
okay,
good.
okay, just to make sure. So the question then that arises out of that is why then did I say it is actually perhaps inhuman? I'll posit this idea to you. I want to know what you think about it. So the aspect of us that is human is deeply rooted in our essence, right? It would not make sense to say that we are not, as humans, essentially human. And if we want to speak about that in spiritual terms, the word that typically gets used is like the soul, right? So the
Mhm.
essence is the soul. The soul is a human soul. There's something that you can't subdivide it out. If you break the human part off, you would end up destroying the aspect that would make it what it is itself, which would essentially destroy that soul, if you will.
The integration of it all.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what I find actually is that institutions at best are tools, right? And what are they tools in service of, right? Because a tool facilitates the function of a thing. And I think fundamentally, for human beings, tools serve let's say, the various, I don't know how to pluralize this in Greek, but the Greek word is telos, or purposes. I like the word function actually, because in English, when I say the word function, I can strip away the subjectivity because a thing does do a thing, right?
Sure.
You can't
Yeah, it's
get
a
away.
utilization of, yeah, or
Right.
purpose. Yeah. I like that.
So what would that mean? Well, that would mean, and I'll wrap this up because I've been jabbering on for a while, as I tend to do. What that would mean is that actually institutions, once we make them, once we solidify them as things separate from us, the living, breathing, if a religious soul-bearing being, they become these artifices, they become constructs. They are no longer alive, and they, like any other tool, are exposed to the atrophy or the enthalpy. Or I don't know what the right thermodynamic term to describe that is, but you understand what I mean. They start to decay, they
Sure.
start to rust, they start to no longer move with, let's say, the rest of the living, breathing. Uh, I don't even say being, but like the rest of existence. I'm going to take a divergence, and hopefully that's right into to Taoism. So in Taoism, they depict the fundamental reality that you cannot describe, the Tao that cannot be named, right?
The
And
mystery.
the mystery as being like a river, right? Because it moves and it's never the same,
Yep.
right? And you can't grasp it, you can't, and it follows its course. And so that you know that thing, that the Tao that cannot be named, to say it that way, is what the institutions are not, and eventually they get left behind as the
Yes. No, I can resonate with all of that. I kind of think of organism and organization. And so a lot of times what happens is things need to be organized. And so that's a good thing. And so we take this beautiful, uh, organic mystery of of life and the soul and the integrated life, when everything's connected, our mind, body, and soul, and we put it into this organized box, such as a church or really any organization, and we put rules and procedures and structure to it. And slowly but surely, as you were saying, it kind of loses that organic nature, and therefore it loses the mystery. And then you have a bunch of people who are part of the organization who now think that they have all the answers, and we are right and everybody else is wrong, and don't tell us that we're wrong. And basically, what we've done is we put God into a box that fits our liking, and any idea outside of that box really is something that we'll reject. And we're the ones, when we do that, that really miss the boat and miss out on the joy and the peace and the purpose, and kind of the life and life to the fullest that's available when we don't put God into that box, and utilize the tool, as you mentioned, kind of the function of what the original purpose was. For just that, a purpose, rather than this is my all in all. I have all the answers, and nobody can tell me differently.
Yeah, so we're jumping down deep rather quickly. I didn't expect us to get here so fast. So this reminds me of the Tower of Babylon. And does that make sense to you immediately, or should I elaborate?
I think I know where you're going, but go ahead and elaborate. Yeah.
All right. So my understanding of the story of the Tower of Babylon is it is when human arrogance or pride reaches such a peak that they seek to make for themselves a godlike edifice, right? Or a god itself. And I think that when people come to worship their institutions, which is like you said, if you can't put God in the box, but if you think you can, you make a box and you think you've got God in there, right?
Yeah.
And then you start worshiping the box that you made and the God that you think that you captured that isn't there. And the Tower of Babel, well, what happens, right? They make this tower that they think can reach the heavens. This is their replacement for God. And the only thing that happens is that their tower falls down and they become divided amongst themselves and can no longer understand one another because, and this is perhaps diving a little bit deeper, but the reason I wanted to talk to you is because I can't dive this much deeper with you without, let's say, losing you in the water. Is that when you build this tower, the tower is not God. And what is God? So my understanding of one of the ways that you say the name of God is it roughly translates to like that I am, or like that is which is, something like that,
Yep.
right?
Yes.
And if you really think about what that means that which is the most real, that which is like I always call it the backstop, like the point at which your opinion does not matter anymore. You hit this, and this is what is. I am that I am. That is
Yes.
which is. So when you build this Tower of Babel, the tower is not that which is, if I switch it to secular speak so our modern people can understand, right? Well, you lose people, right?
Sure.
But if I switch that to secular speak, it's saying building a tower that is out of accord with, let's say, the laws of reality. Of course, it's going to fall. It can do nothing else but fall because it is out of accord with reality, with God, and seeks to replace it.
Yes.
And the reason why the people can't understand each other is because what you're doing when you do that is you're replacing the objective. So God would be the objective, right? Because if God is that which is, God is the object aside from how you perceive it. Does not matter how you think it should be, it is, right?
Yes.
It says to you, I am that I am,
Yep.
and there's nothing that you can do to change it, right? You can kill your brother in the field, and then all that happens is you get cursed,
Yes.
right?
There's consequences that you will face no matter what.
Yes. There is no vengeance against God. There's only vengeance against oneself, right? So then the people are now worshiping their own subjectivity when they worship the Tower of Babel. And when you worship your own subjectivity, there is no common object by which to mediate you and everyone else. Now we can't understand one another, right? You mentioned earlier that in some ways people are seeking back a spirituality, but then you kind of hinted very roughly at a pushing away from that, right? I think that is it's probably like the eternal struggle,
Yes,
right?
exactly. It's something that's always happened, not just these last 4 or 5 years. It's throughout all of human history. We have a tendency to run away from God. My definition of God, it's the same as your definition of God that you gave a moment ago. Run away from God, but also a desire for God. And so it's this weird tension that we live in because we want to be our own gods and we want to be our own leaders of our own life, which makes sense. I mean, why would we want somebody else or something else that we don't understand leading us and guiding us? And we think we can do it better. But Augustine said that the human heart is like a idol making factory or something along those lines. And to your point with the Tower of Babylon, that's exactly it. Is we are trying to be our own God, and so sometimes we make our own self-preservation our God, or achievement or success or whatever thing that we put out there as a goal, which isn't inherently bad or good necessarily in and of itself. But when we make it our everything, then ultimately we are going to be disappointed and it's going to fail us. It's all going to come crumbling down like the tower because it's not, in my mind, what we were created for.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably true beyond just your mind. It's not what we're created for. Otherwise, we'd accomplish it, right? Otherwise, we'd be capable. There's a word. It's getting more use recently. Thanks probably in large part to James Lindsay because he keeps harping on about it. But the word gnosis, right?
Mm.
Now, for you're familiar with the word gnosis, right? So when I say that, what triggers in your mind? What idea?
Share a little bit more about what you mean. I want to make sure that I'm
Okay.
on the
Yeah,
right
no, no,
path
no.
here.
It's we're diving deep here, right? So gnosis is it's not just knowledge, right? Because then I would just use the word knowledge.
Okay.
Gnosis is like
Yes.
this concept of
GNOSIS.
yeah,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Now, the idea of having gnosis is like having a better way to say it is it's like knowing the mind of God, right? Like knowing that is which is in a way that normally by definition no being could actually know, particularly no human being, right?
Okay.
Because if I say, okay, we are human beings and we are human or we are anything, if we were, I don't know, Martians or something, right? It
Sure.
would work the same exact way. It doesn't matter. But we're human beings, and therefore what makes us human necessarily is a set of limitations,
Mhm.
right? Because if you were to strip away all limits, you would strip away all those things that come together to be the emergent thing that is what we are,
Okay.
right? So you can't take away the limits, right? Like if I said, okay, you have an unlimited garden and it's called the forest, it's like you don't have a garden, you that's a jungle and you don't own it, it owns you. Go in there, see what happens,
Sure.
right? So as limited beings, there must necessarily be things outside of our perception, outside of our ability to conceive, right? Because to have an ability to conceive, that is in itself like a garden, a limitation that fulfills, let's say, our human telos. Okay, so gnosis is this idea that one can know beyond that. And why am I bringing that up? Well, in relation to the Tower of Babel, right? It's if anyone thinks this, and if anyone claims this, I'll say this. Adam very well may disagree. Do not take anything I say as being Adam's beliefs unless he says that they
Yeah, I'll
are.
clarify if I strongly disagree.
I actually don't think we will.
Okay.
But
You never know.
I get excited sometimes. So,
Love it.
but to claim that you have gnosis is to claim that one is essentially God, right? It is to construct oneself as one's own Tower of Babel. Um, and it is to, would say, this is a bit of it's not a jump, but it'll feel like it for most people. Because once you go that far, once you say, I have the gnosis, I know, and therefore now I put myself in the position of God, what I'm saying is, I know what ought to be, and what ought to be is different than what is, right? Because it does not make sense to say, I know what ought, and unless you're going to say everything that ought to be already is, in which case it like the point of having gnosis just disappears, right? Because the point of having gnosis is say I know, and therefore you start making arguments that come off of that. So the person who says I know, therefore you should be, you should act this way, you should do this, these people were wrong, because everything that follows after that is the same argument that Mephistopheles makes in Faust. It's the same argument that Satan makes in Paradise Lost. The exact same argument. I've memorized the little Mephistophelian one because it's fun. Because it's in verse. It's uh, I am the spirit that negates, and rightly so, for all that comes to be deserves to perish wretchedly, right? Because if you think you know gnosis, like know with a G, right?
Yeah.
If you know how things ought to be, because you have this, because you yourself are the divine being, then that which is that disagrees with you deserves to be destroyed because it is in opposition to you, because you obviously must be have the will of God, right? um why am I saying all that? I While I've seen a desire and a return for some, deep connection to spirituality, I've seen likewise this, let's say, misplacement of that desire to worship false idols. We could
Yes.
say that. And I suspect, tell me if you think I'm wrong. I think that that is like the most fundamental sin of pride and arrogance that slips in the back door through the feeling it gives one of having power, control, and wisdom that one does not possess. Do you think I'm overstating that?
No, I think that's right on. And it's seems like a very general, but I think it's very broad. It's in every area of our life, not just when it comes to our views on God or religion, but politics, family, success in the workplace, all of that. We can basically think that we have all the answers because that helps us feel like we have control. And when life gets chaotic, that's what we grasp for. We grasp for control. I'm going to check my bank account to make sure the money's still there. I'm going to check it again to make sure it's still there. I'm going to do kind of an audit of my relationships. I'm going to call all my friends and my family just to make sure they still love me. And if you're a parent, you're going to try to control your kids. And you quickly realize that not much is in your control. And if we admit that, man, that can be disorienting. And so it's one of the ways that we can try to uh, put a little bit of a band-aid on that is to find these areas where we can say, I know this is the truth. This is the way that it is, and everybody else is wrong. And when we do that in so many areas of our lives, that we lose a humbleness and we lose a willingness to learn and a willingness to be curious. I believe that basically we're just shutting down a part of uh, who we were created to be, the curious and creative and exploratory and all of that is I believe baked into our DNA, and we essentially shut it off and um, pre- pretend or try to convince ourselves that we have all the answers in the name of God, where God has already told us that we don't have all the answers, but yet in His name we choose to live our lives as if we do have all the answers.
That's literally, correct me if I'm wrong. Is that not literally taking the Lord's name in vain? Like it
Exactly.
take like in the actual meaning of the word vain? Because I know people say that when people curse. And my understanding is that's not what that means. Taking the Lord's name in vain means uh, using the Lord's name to promote one's own vanity, right?
Yeah, misappropriating the name of God. And so, yeah, for my own purposes and reasons. And so if I were to use it for my political, uh, backing, and that was really the only reason that I'm even mentioning God's name, not because I actually worship him or pray, whatever it may be. And so, yeah, that's exactly it. We use the Lord's name in misappropriate in an inappropriate way.
Yeah, and there's another way because you're very nice and you use the word band-aid. Right? I don't really think of the word band-aid, mostly because I've read a bunch of old books where they use a different word. And some people use this for their own malicious purposes, but the metaphor fits. You talked about how difficult it is to be humble in the face of God, and when you experience that humility, it feels simultaneously like pain and humiliation, right? Because you, well, for I think it actually no, I think for almost everyone it does, right? Because what happens is you recognize that you're not as much as that you thought that you were, right? You thought that you were able to do things that you couldn't do. You hit reality, and then you feel the pain of that, the limitation. We have this as human beings, a desire to be able to, um, I'll use the Nietzschean term, fulfill our will to power. Now, all power means, because people, this is probably because of the World War II, and the Nazis really did a number on words. But people think of
Sure.
the word power and they think of like force, like
Yeah.
I'm forcing you. But if you actually think about how you use the word power, like the power that gets delivered via electricity into your house, right? It allows you to do something, right?
Yes.
So when I use that word, all I
It's
mean
like
is,
fuel.
yeah, it's what allows one to, you have an end and you try to complete the end, and then you do. So like if you have the power to make breakfast, you have the power to, I don't know, crack a few eggs into a bowl,
Yes.
make an omelet, um,
Energy, fuel, whatever it
yeah.
is, to help you accomplish a means to an end.
Yeah, so when I say the word will to power, will, really, you can think of it in the German sense, because the word is a German word, and it means desire, basically want. So we have a want to be able to do things like, oh, that's not profound. Um, but when we discover that we can't, we experience that pain. And we use God in a religious sense. I think we also use other false idols to do this as well, not just as small band-aids, but I think perhaps as, um, sometimes people as use them as opiates, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. I
And
agree.
and I think that, you could tell me your experience with this, but I don't see a difference between the, let's say, snake-skinned politician using, let's say, God to promote his campaign to seize political power, and the person using God's name as an opiate in order to protect themselves, as far as using it in vain. Because if you think of the word vanity, right? Because vain, the etymology is the same for vanity. If I'm protecting my own image from myself, is that really different than protecting my image or creating a false image for other people, right? Using
Yeah.
God.
No, I agree. I think it's one and the same for sure.
And, you know, you would ask then, like, well, why is that important, or what's the significance, is perhaps a better question of that. And I would say that, the significance, what's in my head right now is a quote by Carl Jung, and he
Hmm.
says, "Be wary of wisdom that you have not earned."
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, and you might think, well, what is that? What does that mean to you, Adam?
Yeah.
Be wary of wisdom you have not earned.
I use another quote: "Never trust anybody without a limp." What without a limp? Yeah. Never trust
So
anybody without a limp. Big difference between a limb and limp. Yeah. 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 Any of you out there without limbs, yeah, I can trust you. I promise. Yeah. Never trust anybody without a limp, and it kind of goes hand in hand um, in that when somebody has a limp, they have a life experience. They've gone through something, um, and they're willing to be vulnerable and to share their weakness. And so, man, they got something I can actually learn from. And the original quote of Young, what was it again?
Be wary of wisdom you have not earned.
Okay, so wisdom that you haven't earned. I can read a book. I can watch a YouTube video. I can hear a sermon. I can listen to a amazing podcast by a world class thinker like Marquise, and hear a quote or hear a thought and think, that's great. But if I haven't applied it and actually lived it out, then I don't really know it. And so it's head knowledge, but it hasn't sunk down to the core of who I am until I actually have applied it, figured out what works and what doesn't work, and been able to then share it with others from a place of actually knowing, not just knowing a little bit about. And so I think a lot of times we go around sharing information that we've heard other people say, uh, that we've never actually experienced ourselves. And so it's not a deep knowledge, it's a very surface level knowledge that hasn't been earned.
Ooh, you're so nice. Okay, so here's the sharper tongued version of that coming through because the what as you're talking the definition right of belief. I think we should hammer that out. So we just talked about gnosis. We can bring that down a level, and I want to talk about knowledge versus belief versus opinion,
Okay.
and it'll become relevant very fast. So when we say, uh, I'll run through the classic definitions I use and my own personal ones I use for these. So I use the classic for knowledge, which is a justified true belief, right? Now we can get into the weeds about philosophically, like it's almost impossible to actually get knowledge because, like, then you have to know what is true, but then the only that which is true is the same definition as God, and you can't know God
Yeah.
because you're
Where's the mystery and
yeah,
all
yeah.
that? Yeah.
So just we'll set that aside because if you can solve that problem, like you're the most amazing philosopher of the world, and you need to write it in a book and then be remembered for all of time. So then we come to belief and opinion. Now I'm going to jump over belief because I want to come back to it. So I actually hate the word opinion because people mean many different things that really should be mutually exclusive when they use the word opinion. So people, when they use the word opinion, sometimes they mean their preferences. So just like what they prefer, what they like. But then sometimes they use it to mean what they believe is true, right? Believe is true, not what they're claiming knowledge, but what they, if they have to make a bet, that's where they're going to put their money down, right? Um, and I think we should relegate the idea of opinion to preferences and not let opinion touch beliefs. I think it actually profanes the definition of belief that I'm going to put forward. Now, so let's take we've got knowledge on one side; it's kind of inaccessible to us. We've got opinion, which I've now severed from the definition of belief, and I think what we believe is fundamentally what we act in accordance with, or a better way to say that might be uh, how we act as though we thought it were true.
Yes.
Now, you notice I use the word act and I use the word behave. Now, are you good with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. In my opinion, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. No, I am absolutely good with that because even in the Christian tradition in the book of James, it says faith without works is dead. And so and Jesus, and when he teaches in the Sermon on the Mount, he gives some really difficult things to do that a lot of Christians in America today and all around the world don't actually do. And so it's easy for us to then say we believe, but if we don't actually put it into action, do we really believe? Or is it a preference or something, a thought that we like? If we actually believe it, then we are going to take action with intentionality to put it into practice. Now, notice I use the word practice because uh, just because we believe something doesn't mean we're going to do it perfect. But if we actually believe it, we are going to put it into practice with the intention of progressing in our ability to make sure our actions and behaviors, which are the two words you used, actually match our stated belief.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is it suggests this is really important for you listeners out there. Actually, it suggests that what we believe and what we actually believe are not necessarily and perhaps are not often in accord with one another, right? Now, let me put that a different way because that
Perhaps most often. Not just often, most often.
Yeah, I agree with you. Most often, I would say.
Yeah.
But what that means is that we have a great capacity for self-deception.
Deception and denial.
Yeah. And you mentioned before, you called it shallow knowledge. I have a tendency that I try to keep in check because it is, I think, motivated by the same instincts that bring me to a feeling of revenge, which you always have to watch out
Mm.
for. If you don't, if you listeners out there don't think you have it, um, I don't think you're correct. I think everyone needs to pay attention to watch when they're trying to. Would say I called it in a podcast with Broverman. I called it the spirit of Cain, right?
Yeah.
Like, and you have to look because it's if you don't think it's there, all that'll happen is that it'll sneak up on you because you think you're able, and the
Yeah.
same thing will happen to you.
Yeah. It will rear its ugly head at the least opportune time
Yeah.
when you least suspect it.
So
I agree.
yeah, right. I think that's kind of in accord with the idea of original sin, right? That we are these creatures who have this, and we have to carry it with us. But yes, we don't necessarily believe what we think we believe. We believe how we act, which um, I'm interested, really, from a Christian perspective, how one conceives of that. I just don't know. The idea that one has, because I can think about it in a kind of secular psychological way or a union way, where you have this idea of the ego, in a union frame, like an ego. The ego is really it's almost like an intellectual eye. It can point in a direction, but it doesn't actually fundamentally make the choices. You have the rest of you, which Jung essentially. And actually, if you look and read Nietzsche before him, he didn't like the people he called the free thinkers. He liked free spirits, and how he delineated that as the free thinkers are the lineage that eventually gave birth to, you might be familiar with, like the new atheist and those that crowd. Nietzsche didn't like them because he thought they weren't free thinkers. He thought they were uh, conformist and rather shallow minded. He's very judgmental. But what he thought was we should not we should not do away with the conception of the soul. Nietzsche thought that was a bad idea. Nietzsche actually thought that we should take metaphysics and physics and recognize that they should be, I would use the word collapse into one another. If I was Dostoevsky, right, the famous Russian author, I would say something like, we would elevate physics into metaphysics, right? You'd say it the other way around, because he happened to be a religious man himself. And so it doesn't matter which way you want to think about it. But the idea is that we would raise the body to the level of the soul, or Nietzsche would say, bring the soul back down into the body. But that the idea is that our essence, our soul, is not separable from us as we are. It means it's not separable from our instincts. Now I want to bring this back to Yoon, and then I'll throw the question back to you. That's why I
Sure.
had to go so far in the field. But to bring that around in a union sense, what that means is what Yoon called the unconscious, which is the rest of us that isn't just this little section of our brain in the front. So the rest of the brain plus all the hormones of the body plus the our nervous system and its interconnection with just the rest of our material self. We are mostly our soul rather than the ego, and that's not separable from the body. It's like, I don't know, it's like anti-Cartesian dualism, but it's like not two separate, but one the same. Um, and that's what explains the self-deception, is that you have this eye that thinks it knows because it sees, but it doesn't see everything it doesn't see.
Sure.
Right? Does that make
I can,
sense?
I think I'm tracking.
Okay.
Is that kind of like a bad wolf, good wolf? You have both. You have an essence of both. You can't really separate them, but it's whichever one you feed is going to grow within you. I mean,
Yeah, maybe this line, will break that all down into one sentence. Let's see. I know you've got to be familiar with the Solzhenitsyn quote. The heart, or the line between good and evil, runs between the heart of every man. And one more sentence to tack on to that. What that means is that man's heart is both good and evil at the
yes.
same time,
Yep.
which means that there are two
Conflicting.
things. It's
Yeah.
not one. It is one thing because they're two halves of a whole, but
Yes.
it's also two halves of a whole, not just one whole. If that does that make sense?
I got you. I get you. Now, Jesus was confronted by a Pharisee who asked him, what's the greatest commandment of all? And he said, love the Lord your God with all your mind, body, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so there's this integration part of our mind, body, soul, and strength, all of who we are. You get down into you get into Paul's writings, and in Romans chapter 7, he says, "I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I want to do, and I do the things I don't want to do." I'm at war within myself, basically what he says, and a lot of the kingdom of God here on earth talk that Jesus gives throughout the Sermon on the Mount um, is kind of this already not yet uh, language. And I think that's the language of the kingdom of God here on earth. It's already begun. It's happening. The chaos is being put into order, but we, of course, are going to hyper focus on the not yet part until it's complete, and that happens on an individual level too. We are works in progress. None of us have it all figured out. There's mystery. We do our best to put into practice the things that Jesus, and I'm talking from a Christian tradition here, that I do my best to put into practice the things that Jesus has told me to do. They're very difficult to do. When I look back on a more of a macro scale, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, wow, like there's a lot of progress. I would consider it God's grace, but also my intentionality, taking steps, learning lessons, self reflection, self awareness. But on the micro scale, in the moment, it's much easier for me to focus on the not yet. And to see, oh my goodness, like I'm so proud, and I can't believe I made such an arrogant comment, or I can't believe I responded to that person in that way, or man, I wasn't a very loving husband or father today, or whatever it might be, and to get really down on myself. And again, that's on an individual level. But then when I look out at the world, oh my goodness, like the world's falling apart. It's all going to hell in a handbasket. And everything and you just watch the news for 2 seconds and you can see that that's the case. And you can build up your list of reasons why it's not yet as it should be. And so I kind of, in my mind, it's very, very important to remember that we're works in progress, to give myself grace, to give other people grace, to focus on the good that is happening, learn from the bad that has happened and continues to happen and will continue to happen, and move forward and bringing a little bit more of the already into the not yet, if that makes sense.
No, it does. So there's two Zen Buddhist quotes I'm going to throw at you that relate to this. So the first one's from the Hagakure, written by a samurai, Tsunotomo, I think, Yamamoto. And he's essentially, I'm going to paraphrase it because I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's essentially, you know, there is no difference between right now and at that time. And he
Mm,
says that you should think that every day,
mm,
right? There is no difference between right now and at that time. And the next one's a little bit longer, so I'll explain what I think that means. I think what that means is we exist a long time as a dimension, which means, we think of three dimensions like height, length, width, right? And we don't really think about time because we don't we don't see time, we don't handle it. But like there was a you in the past, and then there will be a you in the future, and then there's obviously a termination on our human life, but then the world itself then goes outside of that. And there is no real separation, right, between the time of the past and the time in the future and right now, because we're just a constant continuum moving. And you exist with yourself across that time and with other people across that time. And so you can't really break one moment of time from all the iterations of time forward and backward. We like to do, like you mentioned, we like to do it and think in
yeah.
term in these sections, but the truth is, it's not, oh, I'll do it tomorrow, right? It's like, well, right now is not different than tomorrow. And it's a tomorrow you'll say, I'll do it tomorrow, right? It's when you realize, that you are living your life right now and the decisions that you're making right now. Remember, we talked about belief for those of you out there listening who might have forgot. What you believe is in accord with how you act,
Mm.
because you can lie to yourself, but your actions don't lie. Because if you're acting that way, it's now in accord with what you believe,
Yeah, that's true.
right?
What you do is who you are, is a
Yeah,
quote that I've heard. And I think that's so true. And so that puts it into perspective of I can say, well, I believe this and I'm going to be this person someday. But if my day-to-day actions in the big things and the small things show something different, well, what I'm doing in the small things is who I will be in every area of my life in one way or another.
yeah.
So I think that kind of connects a little bit.
I mean, it is actually a really great way to unpack, because like there's everybody's like let's make everything tiny, right? But it's a really way to unpack that same idea. It's like, yeah, the way that if you come home from work, and you've got a spouse or your kids, the way that you welcome them. I don't know, it's weird to say welcome, but like the way you interact with them right when you come home, you're going to do that a thousand times. And so that small action is going to get iterated over and over and over again. And it is going to be one of many things like that that exist within each moment that will make up the majority of your relationship with that person. Because we think of like the big events, but like it's the
Yeah.
small moments, moment to moment to moment,
Yeah.
that are going to change that. The other quote I had, it's actually like a tiny little mini micro story. Again, I'll paraphrase, but essentially, there's a young monk in a monastery, and all the other monks hear like, oh, we've heard he's reached enlightenment. I believe the Kyojin is the monk's name, and they all rush up to Kyojin because they're all excited, and he's like, is it true that you've reached enlightenment? It's like, yeah, and he's
Yep.
like, oh, what is it like? What is it like? And he waits for a second. He's like, or no, they ask, how does it feel having reached enlightenment? And his answer to them, I love his answer. He says, "Yeah, it's as miserable as ever." But I mean, that struck me. I read that when I was a teenager, and I have never, ever for a moment forgotten that story, because as a teenager, I kind of got the message. The state of enlightenment is not peace from all suffering. That's what Kyojin just articulated. You're going to be like, there's no escape from misery. There's a question about whether you accept the fact that there is going to be misery and pain and suffering and conflict in life, and there always is, because if you eliminate all conflict outside of you, guess where you're going to find it? Inside.
Yes.
It's still going to be there. And so peace, is to you could say, put one's will in accord with what is, rather than to make it in opposition to what is. So, in a Christian sense, it's to make your will in alignment with God's will,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Let me
That's
know.
the prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so rather than praying that this pain and suffering go away, which is something that a lot of Christians do, we all do, regardless of our religious tradition, uh, rather than praying for that, and there's nothing wrong with asking for that, I don't think, but acknowledging that this is going to be an ongoing part of my life, and what can I learn from it, and how can I grow from it, and how can I be a better service as a result of this. And so when suffering happens in my life, um, when we have that perspective, or even if it's years later, we're able to look back and have some self-awareness and some perspective, then it changes everything, because we're not looking to avoid the pain and the suffering, being rescued away from this evil world, which so many Christians are longing for, as opposed to understanding that we have an opportunity to actually be a part of bringing God's beauty and love and grace into this world, which He created and loves. And so that's my personal belief, and that's a whole nother rabbit trail there, but kind of relates.
And it absolutely relates, right? Because it's saying, right now to drop back to that. Right now is not different from at that time. If you Right now is not different from like being in paradise in the kingdom of heaven. That's what that means. So if to realize like to if you can look at the world, if you can look at what God made, I'm going to speak in Christian terms, even though those listening probably know I'm not a Christian myself. Though I keep finding that I talk to Christians, and it's like I just agree with you about just about everything. I don't, which confuses me. You can tell me what you think about that because that's something that's been not addling my mind, kind of addling my mind. But anyway, I'm again losing myself. So to recognize, it's like you look at what God made, and like God, you say that is good, right? Because that's like the beginning of Genesis. God's. I'm going to misquote it.
Yeah,
Something like God spake upon the face of the waters, and He makes it. He says that is good. Over, I think it's like over and over again,
yeah, over
right?
and over again. Created man, it
Right.
is good.
And this will be a little bit more of a controversial statement. We don't have to go into it, but something that Nietzsche said was he thought that the only real Christian, was Christ on the cross, and he thought that for a specific reason. That actually is actually really pro-Christian for the book that he put it in, which was a book called The Antichrist. Which halfway through The Antichrist, he's like, and here's how to read this story and for it to have tons of value. And it's like Nietzsche, you're a troll. That's what you are. You're a 19th century troll.
Yeah.
But he said, like, look, what makes Christ the Christian is that he, in his absolute state of suffering, said, "Forgive them.
Father, forgive them,
They
for they
know
know not what
what
they
they
do.
do."
Yeah.
Right? To say, like, look, I'm not blaming you.
Yes.
This is the way it is, and that release of blame, which is fundamentally like a letting go of the spirit of vengeance, right? Like to not blame them is to not want vengeance on them, to say, I know that I'm in absolute agony, but this is God's will. And rather than me I wasn't in agony, to accept the fact that I'm in, this physical pain, but I accept that, right? That is the, let's say, the convergence of the now and at that time, right? Now to recognize that you tell me if I've gone too far with this, but it's like saying the kingdom of God is in oneself right then, at that moment that one acts like Christ acted, which is to say one believes in Christ. Because if you act in accordance with that, right, that would
Yes.
be to say that you believe.
Yeah.
And is that not,
There's congruence there, right?
yeah.
Between our action and our belief.
And is that not, would you say is that not what faith is then?
I agree, and I think that that's something that a lot of Christians, unfortunately, um, have in one sense, they've made it more complicated, their definitions of things like faith and salvation, and but in another way, they've way oversimplified it, and as a result, it just becomes something that even the vast majority of folks that go to church and call themselves Christians don't have a grasp on what Christ's intentions were and what he actually is calling people to do when they follow him. And what you just said, coming from a Nietzsche quote, is way more in alignment with Christ values and what he calls us Christ followers to do than what many of us had been portrayed growing up in our church, going to Sunday school. And it's really unfortunate because the I believe that Christ followers throughout the centuries, a lot of good was done. Now, obviously, we can look at history and we can see that a lot of bad was done too in the name of God and in the name of Jesus. But again, that's the already not yet on a more macro, even governmental type of level. And so I think what we have a tendency to do is throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that's what I did. I was never grew up in a Christian home. My dad hated Christianity. His dad had been a pastor, and so he saw the hypocrisy and he saw the organizational structure, that flawed system that his father had been a part of, and he threw the baby out with the bathwater. And so when I uh, became a Christ follower at 16 and told him that I might want to become a pastor, he said, if you move in with if you go to that Bible college to become a pastor, you're wasting your mind, and I'm not going to give you a dime. He said, you go to any other college, I'll pay for it. But if you go to become a pastor, I'm not giving you a dime. And so I joined the Army National Guard so that I could help pay for it myself, and went to school and became a youth pastor, and then a pastor of a church that was way more legalistic. And back to our conversation, kind of put God into a box, and was very limiting into the ways that I could live my life and the ways that I could do ministry. And it became overwhelming to have that freedom restricted in every area of my life. And it just didn't seem to match up with the ways of Jesus. And I said, if this is what it means to follow Jesus, or to be a pastor, or to be a Christian even, I'm done. And I literally threw the baby out with the bathwater. And not sure if listeners out there are familiar with the story of Jonah, but God had a calling on Jonah's life, and Jonah said, "Nope, I'm out of here." And literally didn't even stay where he was in Joppa. Went 2,500 miles the opposite direction to Tarshish. Called to Nineveh, goes to Tarshish, literally the end of the world at that known time. And and that's what I did. And I said, I'm done with this. And I went and got my MBA and got into banking, and um, just set up more goals and idols for myself and reached them and kept getting promoted. And I had the success of the world, but was still empty inside. And it's kind of a crazy thing to think this time around, when one crazy story after another that we may or may not have time for, but no need to get into it right now. Of never thought I'd be back in the ministry, but here I am. And it was one of those things of what are your frustrations with the Christian faith and how it's portrayed? Um, and can you do it in a way that's different than that? And really, a lot of that is blaming and criticizing other churches and other organizations. And even until 5 or 6 years ago, that was a lot of my message. Look how bad those Christians are. Look how bad those churches are. Look what it did to me. And here we go back to a story that you mentioned earlier, where a lot of blame. And that's our tendency, is to blame others, to criticize others. Whereas recently I've kind of learned to look inside for a little bit of self-awareness, and what can I take ownership of in how I reacted when they treated me that way, or when I disagreed with them. Um, and how can I perhaps do that in a way that's more in alignment with Christ? And as I change myself and the way that I understand what it means to follow Christ, then I'm able to portray that to my church, and even more importantly, to people outside of the church that I meet at a coffee shop or meet for a drink somewhere, and I'm able to just talk about their life and get to know them and meet them where they're at. And oftentimes learn from them just as much, if not more, than what I have to teach them. And so, um, kind of off track there, but it just kind of made me begin to think about how Christianity has been portrayed in a way that, especially in the last, I don't know, 100 years or so, in a way that's pretty different than the way that Christ portrayed it, or intended for it to be.
I would love to go on, but I think, are past our time, so we better wrap it up. I really do have like a bunch of
You know, I
questions.
start I start talking about Christianity, and you're like, "We're out, we're out."
No, no, I actually do. Keep
Yeah,
going.
I
There's
I don't mind going for another maybe 15 or 20 minutes if you want.
well, okay.
It
Um,
depends. And if you think we're going to jump into a topic that's going to go past that, then maybe we shouldn't.
let's just push in one more question because I really am really curious about this.
Okay.
So, um, I have found, I mentioned it earlier, um, really getting along with Christians. A lot of my friends, people I interact with now, happen to be people of faith, and I'm very happy to interact with them. Um, and my curiosity, and you just mentioned going out and talking and meeting with other people and trying to learn from them. And um, what the question I want to ask is, why is it that you think, despite coming from perhaps a number of very different and disparate, let's say, spiritual or philosophical backgrounds, like we can sit down and have this conversation, and we have absolutely no trouble understanding one another, and we don't really even disagree. I'm pretty sure we don't actually disagree about. Did we during the whole conversation? I think I really pushed it.
Yeah, not once. I mean, even all your quotes and philosophers and different religious pundits, and not once did I disagree with anything that you said.
So how is that possible? Because on the face of things, you would think from an outside perspective, like
Yeah,
we should, we don't. Like what do you think is happening?
I think that back to the very beginning of the conversation when you kind of talked about laws of the universe, I think you touched on that just a tad. That uh, there are laws that are perhaps beyond our ability to fully understand or comprehend, that uh, no matter who we are, we're created in God's image. Now, we might not fully understand who God is or what, or be able to define him in the same way, but we are created in God's image. And we have a natural tendency to run away from our stated purpose, and we have a natural tendency to run towards. And all of these different traditions and philosophies are man's attempts at running towards. And because we have that same DNA baked into us as beings, human beings created in God's image. Again, this is my belief, not my opinion, and that because that's baked into us, that we're going to find we're much more likely when we set aside our pride or we set aside, that strict kind of pharisaical organization of this is the way that it is, that we're going to find much more in common than we ever will to disagree. And sometimes it's just the willingness to see the commonality. It's always been there, but things like language can complicate it to where little things that maybe are nuanced we don't see we see as that's a wall that I'm not willing to cross over, when in reality it's actually not that big of a wall, as we're the ones creating the wall.
Yeah, that reminds me, for the listeners who might have listened to it, there's a conversation between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. And Sam Harris comes from the New Atheist. And I had actually known about him way before I knew about Jordan. Now, I watched their conversation with great frustration because Sam essentially had the equivalent of like PTSD with anything that uses religious language in the
Yes.
traditions he had battled against. So, Jordan would say something that, Brett Weinstein, who I think moderated their big discussions they had, there four of them, who would say, "Oh, I know what you mean. Like when Jordan says this, he means this." So you could just translate. He didn't get like triggered by the language. But I think oftentimes when we think that we know with a G, gnosis, right?
Yes.
We think that we know. It's not different than building our own little Tower of Babylon, whether we think that we know through our ideology, which is essentially like a Tower of Babylon pseudo religion, or we think we know because we have put God in a box, and now that we control the box, we know, right? That prevents us from talking to one another. Tower of Babylon, if you didn't get it in your head,
Yeah.
I mean that's the story, right? And so perhaps it's in the moment that you're willing to be humble, or that I'm willing to be humble, we don't get caught up in these language traps, and we identify that we're talking about the same thing. I came a bunch of things in my head. So there's a chapter in the Zhangzi. It's one of the Taoist texts, and it's what is it? Fragmentation betokening full virtuosity. And what that means is that it is being broken um, by your interface with the Tao, which I translate that to a Christian language, right? Like we were saying, we're trying to do is
Sure.
you interact with God, and when you what happen, or we wrestle with God. We were talking about before we
Yeah.
recorded. What happens? So he dislocates your hip.
Mhm.
You become someone with a limp, like
Yeah.
you were saying, right?
Never trust anybody without a
Without a
limp.
limp, right? Well, that's because you come to virtue, which the classic Greek idea of virtue essentially is that you are able to bring about able to bring about your will. Well, the best way to do that is to make your will in accord with that which is, right?
Yes.
You
Yes.
transform the self in one's own desires to be in accord with that which is making your will in alignment with God's will. And you do that through allowing yourself to be broken, by allowing yourself to suffer, by, again, Christian language, bearing your cross.
Yeah.
Then that transforms you into someone who your will comes about because your will is not different,
Yeah. It's in alignment with.
right? Or I can even put this in secular language. The reason I'm doing that is because I want the audience
Sure.
to hear how it's not different. Doesn't matter really where you're coming from. So the secular way, if I say you're one of the hard secular atheists out there, well, if you would say are a proponent of Darwinian evolution, I happen to be. Um, the line that makes us what we are is heritable, right? We inherit it from our ancestors. Now, the ancestors that did not successfully propagate in accord with reality, right, which isn't different from the idea of God, they didn't propagate, so their genes didn't pass on. So they do not have the instincts that make them in the image of God. Because there's no difference
Yeah.
between being, let's say, making yourself in the image of God by wrestling with God, coming away with a limp. It's so funny to say that because that means being injured by interfacing and wrestling with God makes you more God
Like.
like, not
Yeah.
God, but God
Yeah.
like.
Sure.
And that's not different with the idea that your ancestors, the evolutionary path of human beings is in accordance with God because everything that wasn't in accordance with God didn't propagate.
Yeah.
So there, I've done secularism, I've done East Asian religion and philosophy and Christianity, and it's the same thing.
Absolutely.
So
I'm right. I'm right there with you. It's and into evolution stuff. I mean, the trauma from generations and from that's a whole different podcast and a whole different path there. But I'm right there with you, and I think it's a beautiful thing that we can learn from each other, and um, hopefully that is something that we can continue to grow in as a culture is being able to ask questions, being able to see how there really are connections. And that is something that you do a great job of asking questions, being curious, sharing your knowledge freely and openly, being very vulnerable, but also asking how it relates. And I think that that's something that a lot of, in particular, evangelical Christians can learn a lot from instead of holding up signs or protesting or feeling like our rights are being taken away. Actually um, getting to know people, seeing them, seeing the commonalities rather than the things that we presume to be different, and starting there, and then friendships can happen, and unity can happen, even if um, they don't come over to our side on a certain issue or belief, and we don't go over to that side. We kind of can see that there's common threads because we are human beings, and we can move forward and make the world a better place than if we are so um, just proud and kind of absolutely set on my way or the highway. Everybody else is wrong and evil, and pushing others away. And I sadly think that's way too common today.
yeah, well, hopefully this conversation will have done quite a bit to correct that. At least I hope so. All right, folks. I've extracted quite a bit of Adam's time, but I'm very thankful that you came here. This is a really, really great conversation.
Yeah, awesome. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Yeah. Before we go, I'll do my quick outro. For those of you who've listened this far, thank you so much. I want to direct you back to my website, Wild Isle Lit. You can listen to the rest of the podcast like this. If you want conversations very similar to this, all of mine with Josh end up coming here, Josh Broberman, and then the one with Alan also. We dove a little bit into spirituality as well, so you can get those there. I have my editing service. I won't go through the whole spiel again. Also, my book, Wand Smoke Broken. Check that out. Lastly, I'll throw a word in. If you're listening to this right when it comes around about when it comes out, I have a Kickstarter campaign I want to promote really just very shortly. I am rather an impoverished philosopher, as most philosophers were. It's easier in Greece when you could just be a hobo on the street and then like yell at young people and then get money somehow. But no, you could help out quite a lot for Wand Smoke Tales from the Labyrinth. I've been promoting it all over my social media. You should be able to find it pretty easily. You can sign up to my mailing list. I'll definitely throw out an email in the middle of the month about the Kickstarter campaign. It runs until June 26th. So please help out if you can. It'll pay for the book covers. I'm going to be releasing 5 different installments. So the covers are going to be kind of expensive across them. All right. That's enough of my shilling. Thank you so much, Adam, for coming on, and we'll see you guys all next time. Greetings, friends. Thank you for tuning in. If you're watching or listening between May 27th and June 26th of 2023, I have an important announcement. A Kickstarter campaign is currently underway to fund the covers for the upcoming Wand Smoke short story series, Tales from the Labyrinth. Please like, comment, and share this video or podcast to help spread the message as far as possible. And if you'd like to donate, click the Kickstarter link in the description to support the campaign. You'd be helping fund 5 book covers. That's 5 releases over the course of the year and 5 steps closer to bringing a dream into reality. Thank you so much, friends. I look forward to sharing these stories with you.